For 30 years, the death of Marcus Bell was a drowning. A 19-year-old found in the river outside Cypress Landing, Georgia, in the summer of 1989. A young man who, the county decided within a day, had been drinking and gone into the water and not come out. There was no autopsy worth the name, no investigation worth the word. Marcus Bell was black, and the river that took him ran through a county that did not look very hard at how young black men died in it. It would take 30 years, a sister who never stopped saying her brother could swim, and a forensic re-examination that found what a county had refused to look for, to prove that Marcus Bell did not drown, and to name the men who put him in that river. That is not a story about a young man who drank too much and drowned. That is a story about a death a county chose not to investigate, and the 30 years it took for anyone with power to finally ask what really happened on the riverbank that night. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to South Georgia in the summer of 1989, and to the young man whose death the county was so quick to write off. Cypress Landing in 1989 sat on a slow brown river in South Georgia. Live oaks and Spanish moss and tobacco fields. A town of maybe 3,000 where the past was not as past as people like to pretend. Integration had come a generation before, but the old lines still ran underneath everything. Where you lived, where you worked, which side of certain rooms you stood on, and when something went wrong, how hard anyone looked. It was a town of two memories, the white one and the black one, that rarely matched. Everyone knew everyone in the way of small towns, and everyone in the black community of Cypress Landing knew Marcus Bell, even if the county that ruled on his death barely bothered to. Marcus Bell was 19, a strong, easy-laughing young man, the son of a deacon and a schoolteacher. The first in his family headed to a 4-year college on a partial scholarship that fall. He was going to study engineering, and he'd talked about it since he was a boy, taking apart radios and putting them back together. He had grown up on that river. He was, every person in his community would attest without hesitation, a powerful swimmer, a boy who'd swum that slow brown water since before he could properly walk, who'd pulled younger kids out of the current more than once, and been thanked at church for it. He worked summers at the lumber yard. Hard work he never complained about. He had a girlfriend the family knew about, Cassandra, and one they would learn about only much later, and a little sister, Renee, 12, who worshipped the ground he walked on. And Marcus had one habit his family held close. Every Sunday after church, he'd take Renee fishing off the old trestle, and he'd let her believe she was baiting her own hook while he quietly did it for her, so she wouldn't prick her fingers, and he'd promised her, in the easy way of a big brother, that when he made it as an engineer, he'd build their mama a house with a wide porch facing the water. Renee carried that promise the rest of her life. On the night of July 22nd, 1989, Marcus Bell went out to meet someone down by the river, and the next morning he was found dead in the water, and a county that should have asked 100 questions asked almost none. Here is what was done, which was close to nothing. Marcus's body was found in the river by the old landing. The sheriff, a man named Buck Tatum, looked at a dead young black man in the water and reached, fast, for the explanation that required the least of him. The boy had been drinking, gone into the river, and drowned. There was, conveniently, an empty bottle near where his shoes were found on the bank. There was no real autopsy. The county coroner, with no pressure from anyone who mattered to look harder, signed off on accidental drowning. No one canvassed who Marcus had gone to meet that night. No one asked why a young man known county-wide as a strong swimmer would drown in water he'd swum his whole life. No one examined the marks on his body. The case was effectively closed before his family had finished making the funeral arrangements. In the official memory of Cyprus Landing, Marcus Bell drank and drowned, and that was the end of it. The detail that should have stopped everyone was the swimming. Marcus Bell was not a boy who drowned in the river. He was the boy who pulled other people out of it. Every person in the Black community knew it. His mother said it. His sister said it. His swim coach from the segregated in-memory side of the county pool said it. A strong swimmer does not drown in calm, familiar water on a summer night. But the people who knew this had no standing with the people who'd ruled on his death, and the two memories of Cyprus Landing did not speak to each other, and so the impossible drowning stood. The person who never accepted it, who could not accept it, was Renee, his little sister, 12 that summer, the girl he'd taught to fish off the trestle. She knew her brother could swim. She knew it the way you know the sun comes up. She said it to anyone who would listen, and as she grew, she said it louder. My brother did not drown. My brother could swim. Somebody put him in that river. For decades, it was the truth no one with power would hear. A Black woman insisting her brother had been killed in a county that had decided long ago and without looking that he had not. It changed nothing official, but Renee built her life around it. She became a lawyer. She did it in part because she had learned at 12 exactly how it feels to hold the truth and have no power to make anyone listen. And she meant to get the power. The institutional failure here was not a single error. It was a whole system's choice not to look. A young Black man's death by water in a South Georgia county in 1989 was the kind of death the official machinery was practiced at, processing quickly and forgetting. No autopsy, no canvas, no questions, because no one with authority felt the obligation to ask them, because of who Marcus was, and where he lived, and the long shadow the town pretended was gone. Marcus Bell wasn't failed by a botched investigation. He was failed by the absence of one, by a county that did not consider his death worth the trouble of the truth. Then the case went cold the instant it was ruled a drowning, because a drowning is not a case, it is a closing. The river ran on. The white memory of Cyprus Landing forgot Marcus Bell entirely. The Black memory never did, but memory without power changes nothing on paper. For 30 years, the official story held. By 1999, 10 years had passed. Marcus's father, the deacon, had died still grieving the son who was going to be an engineer, never having heard the county admit there was anything to grieve beyond an accident. His mother kept his college acceptance letter framed on the wall of the front room, where every visitor would see it, because she would not let the world forget what her son had been bound for. Cassandra, the girlfriend, had moved away to begin again somewhere the river didn't run. Sheriff Tatum had retired, his handling of the Bell death never questioned, because in the county's official mind, there had been nothing to question. A boy drank, a boy drowned, the end. And Renee was in college, then in law school, carrying her brother's name and her mother's wall toward a future she was building, deliberately, brick by brick, to be able someday to demand the truth from people who would never give it to a powerless girl. By 2014, Renee Bell was an established civil rights attorney, and the country had begun, in places, to reckon with exactly the kind of death her brother had died. Old cases of Black victims whose deaths were never investigated, pulled back into the light by a new generation of prosecutors and by units created for that very purpose. Marcus's mother was old now and frail, and Renee had made her a private promise to match her childhood one, that she would not let her mother die before the truth about Marcus was on the record, in the county's own hand. She had spent years quietly gathering what little existed. The thin coroner's file, the few old photographs, and most importantly, the names of the people who had seen Marcus in his last days and hours, and had never once, in all that time, been asked a single thing. Every case we cover on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, court files, and the lives of people who deserve to be remembered. If you want us to keep telling these stories the way they ought to be told, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It honestly is what keeps this channel going. Now, let's get back to Marcus. The case had been closed for 30 years when Renee Bell's persistence finally met a system willing to reopen it. In 2019, a state cold case unit, one created specifically to review old, unsolved, racially suspect deaths, took up the Bell case at Renee's documented and relentless urging, and did the two things Cypress Landing had never done in 1989. They re-examined the body, and they asked the questions. Here is the forensic truth, and it required no exotic technology, only the willingness, finally, to look. Marcus Bell's remains were exhumed and given the autopsy he'd never received, and the examination found what a real investigation in 1989 would have found. Marcus had not drowned. There was, in fact, almost no water in what could be assessed of his lungs by modern re-examination of preserved tissue and bone. He had been dead, or nearly, before he entered the river. There were injuries, to the back of the head, to the body, consistent not with a fall into water, but with a beating, inflicted before he was put in the river. Marcus Bell had been killed on the bank, and his body had been placed in the water he'd swum his whole life, to be written off as exactly the drowning the county had been so willing to call it. Renee Bell was in her law office when the state investigator called to say the forensics confirmed what she had been saying since she was 12. Her brother had not drowned. Her brother had been killed. She had been right for 30 years, and she had built an entire life to be standing where she could finally hear it confirmed. She said afterward that she went home and sat with her elderly mother and told her, and that her mother only nodded, because a mother had never needed the state of Georgia to tell her how her son could swim. A body placed in the river meant someone had placed it there, and now, at last, the questions got asked. Investigators found the witnesses no one had interviewed in 1989. People who, after 30 years and with the county's old power structure gone, were finally willing to talk. Marcus, it emerged, had gone to the river that night to meet a young white woman he'd been quietly seeing, a relationship that in that county in 1989 was still dangerous in ways the official town pretended it wasn't. Her brother and another man had found out. The witnesses and the evidence pointed to two men, the woman's brother, Wendell Garrett, and his friend Ronnie Doss, both in their early 20s in 1989, who had confronted Marcus on the riverbank that night over the relationship, beaten him, and put him in the river, confident, with good reason, that the death of a young black man in the water would never be looked at twice. They had been right for 30 years. Wendell Garrett and Ronnie Doss were in their early 50s now, both still in the area, ordinary men who'd lived ordinary, unremarked lives in a county that had never once asked them where they were the night Marcus Bell died. They had not been hidden behind wealth or power. They had been hidden behind a county's indifference, behind the certainty that no one would ever investigate, because the system had decided in advance that Marcus's death didn't merit it. The reopened investigation built the case with the forensic findings and the witnesses who would finally speak. The autopsy gave them the murder. The witnesses gave them the riverbank, the confrontation, the two men. And confronted at last, 30 years on, with the science and the statements, the account came apart. One of the two men, facing the evidence, admitted what had happened on the bank that night, and named the other. Both were arrested in 2019 and charged with the murder of Marcus Bell. When the truth came out, Cyprus Landing's two memories were forced, at last, into the same room. The arrests shocked the white half of the county that had forgotten Marcus Bell entirely. The black half of the county was not shocked by the fact of it. They had known the shape of the truth for 30 years, but was shaken to finally see it acknowledged, to watch the state of Georgia say out loud that Marcus Bell had been murdered and that his death had been ignored. The reckoning was not only with two men, but with a county that had chosen, in 1989, not to look. Wendell Garrett and Ronnie Doss were convicted. The case became part of the record of a state finally revisiting the deaths it had once waved past. Marcus Bell's death certificate was corrected, after 30 years, from accidental drowning to homicide. And Renee Bell, the 12-year-old who'd insisted her brother could swim, now the lawyer who'd built her life to prove it, stood on the courthouse steps with her aged mother beside her and said that her brother had been going to build their mother a house with a porch facing the water, and that he had not drowned in that water, that he had been a strong swimmer and a good man and the first of them bound for college, and that it had taken 30 years only because the county had refused for 30 years to ask a single honest question. Marcus Bell was 19 years old. He was a deacon's son bound for engineering school, a young man who'd swum that brown river his whole life and pulled other people out of it, who took his little sister fishing every Sunday and promised to build his mother a house facing the water. He did not drown. He was beaten to death on a riverbank for loving the wrong person in the wrong county in 1989 and put in the water because a county would call it a drowning without ever looking. And for 30 years, it did. The sister who knew at 12 that he could swim became the lawyer who forced the truth onto the record and lived to see her brother's death finally named. And a young man written off by a county that didn't care was, at last, accounted for. It makes you wonder. How many deaths of young black men and women were ruled accidents and drownings and never investigated because a system decided in advance that they weren't worth the questions? How many families have held the truth for decades with no power to make anyone listen? And what does it say that the difference between a buried injustice and a solved murder was, in the end, a sister who spent 30 years and an entire career getting close enough to power to be heard? Tell us in the comments, do you think Marcus's death would ever have been re-examined without his sister's 30-year fight? What detail stayed with you most? That he was the one who pulled others from the river, the autopsy he never got, the house with the porch he meant to build. And how many accidental drownings and accidents from that era do you believe were never accidents at all? Justice came for Marcus Bell after 30 years, carried there by a sister who refused to be unheard, and a state that finally agreed to look. Stories like his remind us that a death uninvestigated is not a death explained, that the truth can be held by the powerless for decades before the powerful will hear it, and that being finally believed and named and counted is its own form of justice. If you believe that too, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are waiting in the description. Thank you for watching.